Sega's sprite scaling arcade ambitions began all the way back in the late 1970s. These games were incredibly simple, but Sega was intent on making their games look and feel three-dimensional. Their technology received a major boost in 1985 when the Hang-On board was created. This stepped up the complexity by displaying many more sprites than before. This hardware gave us the likes of Enduro Racer and Space Harrier as well. Sega stepped things up again the following year with the board that powered Outrun. It was very similar to the previous iteration, but now had faster processors, more memory, and a number of new features that really upgraded the experience. This board also was used for Turbo Outrun. The thing is that Sega had essentially made these boards custom, resulting in multiple PCBs, which meant that every arcade machine that used them was extremely expensive. Sega wanted to streamline the technology and condense it into a single PCB that was easily mass-produced. That technology would land in 1987 in the form of the Sega X board. Along with being easier to produce, Sega also upgraded the Outrun technology with more RAM, more on-screen objects, more color, and the ability to rotate sprites and backgrounds. This board was by far Sega's most advanced technology to date, and a huge step forward for their ambitions to rule the arcade. In this episode, we will be going over the games you could play on the Sega X board, which were some of the most memorable experience of that era. Afterburner was first released in Japan in July of 1987, developed by the Yu Suzuki-led Studio 128. This was an on-rail shooter where you pilot a fighter jet against nearly impossible odds. You get a Vulcan machine gun and a stack of missiles as your only defense. The visuals here were eye-popping in 1987, but it was the deluxe sit-down cab that made it what it was. This sucker would pitch forward, backwards, left, and right according to how you move the flight stick. The visuals make heavy use of sprite and background rotation at astonishing speeds, easily one of the fastest games available. When this was released in the West, Sega added more stages and tweaked some of the gameplay, calling it Afterburner 2. It's not a sequel in the traditional sense, but more of a content update. There was a vanilla stand-up version of the cabinet that wasn't nearly as fun, and it was ported home to most console and computers that were available. So revolutionary was this beast, it would take nearly 8 years for home consoles to do it justice, but even then, it lacked the thrill of that awesome sit-down unit. At the very end of 1987, Sega released Thunderblade, an on-rail shooter where you pilot a combat helicopter through enemy-infested levels. It was heavily influenced by the film Blue Thunder, a movie the developers at Sega R&D1 must have loved. Like Afterburner, you have machine guns and missiles to take down your foes. This one was way more impressive visually to me than Afterburner. There seemed to be a lot more on screen, and you often had to fly through obstacles and caves, giving everything a really solid three-dimensional feel. There were even overhead stages where you could control the height, which featured full-screen scaling all around you. The sit-down unit for this looked like a small helicopter, and it had an extended flight stick to simulate accurate control. But boy was it hard. Though slower than Afterburner, there was a ton going on all around you. It was so easy to take damage or fly straight into an obstacle. Unfortunately, the arcade version wasn't brought home accurately until the 3DS 3D Classics release many years later. The earlier ports we did get were so heavily cut back or changed, they often felt like completely different games. There is a stand-up cabinet for this one that is far more common these days. The deluxe unit was definitely the better way to experience it, however. Last Survivor is a 1989 arcade cabinet I have never seen with my own eyes. To be honest, I'm not even entirely sure this was ever sold as a retail game. I know it did get various location tests across the globe, but beyond that I don't think Sega mass-produced it in any real capacity. This was a third-person shooter developed by Sega R&D 1, with a camera behind a see-through character on the screen. It featured split-screen mazes and open arenas where players would roam around and shoot one another while trying to get keys to open a door to treasure. The control was extremely weird as the joystick could rotate to do the same for your viewpoint. It made the gameplay really tough to get into, especially when you had players all around you, pounding you with damage. The cabinets could be networked up to 8 players in what had to be one of the first games of its type. Of course, going back and playing this now, it feels slow and plodding, at least on emulators like MAME. It was ported to the FM Towns in 1990 and had a cancelled Sega Mega Drive version around that same time. Super Monaco GP was another Sega R&D 1 1989 release, but this one was made for the arcade and Sega knew it. It ran on an upgraded X board that was absolutely gorgeous. It didn't have an F1 license and featured original tracks from around the globe. It was a continuation of the game Monaco GP released all the way back in 1979. This also had a deluxe sit-down unit and an upright cabinet available, though the deluxe unit wasn't anything particularly special. One of the more interesting things about Super Monaco GP is the lawsuit that resulted from Sega using unauthorized Marlboro cigarette ads on the billboards in the game. Philip Morris was afraid that it would be seen as a legitimate attempt by them to advertise towards kids, and they asked Sega to remove the billboards. Sega complied, but the cigarette maker was unhappy with the conversion process and sued Sega in 1991. It resulted in a settlement, and Sega would make it a point to not closely approximate real-life brands from that point forward. It came home to the Genesis and multiple computer platforms starting in 1990, though none of those were even close to the visual finesse of this arcade version. Sega R&D 1 was working non-stop on the X board, and in 1989 they also released Line of Fire. It's a gun game that looks like someone put Wolfenstein 3D on autopilot, and all you have to do is shoot the enemies. The sense of 3D space here is exceptional, and this was a beauty upon its release. The forward-scrolling sprite scaling is very convincing and almost looks polygonal. You are part of a team that must escape from behind enemy lines. It features 2-player co-op, inside and outside environments, as well as air and sea battles. It puts you in mind of other Sega games like Jurassic Park and Rail Chase. The giant machine guns mounted to the cabinet had a vibration feedback, so it felt like you were firing an actual weapon. There was both a sit-down and stand-up version of this game, and they both were awesome multiplayer experiences. The home games were ports in name only, or just outright different games altogether, like the Master System release. We never got this at home in all its glory, a sad fact that remains the case today. Sega released Racing Hero for the X board in 1990. This was the motorbike equivalent of Outrun. You get a course that has multiple internationally inspired routes to choose from, and a time limit to beat as the traffic rages all around you. The visuals are pretty solid and it plays well enough, but I never saw it as a kid. I don't think it was widely released outside of Japan, and it never received a home port. The biggest issue it had was speed. It's nowhere near as fast as it should be, likely a result of so many cars and trucks on the course and so many sharp turns. If it were any faster, it'd probably be unplayable. Even so, it would have been an excellent addition to something like the 32X or Sega CD, but alas, we got nothing of the kind. Sega R&D 8 was responsible for 1990's GP Rider. This was a motorcycle game as well, but it was more in line with competitive racing instead of just navigating busy city streets. It was in many ways a continuation of what Sega had been doing with Hang On, now with vastly superior visuals thanks to the power of the X board. I never cared for this because it's so damn difficult, however. Whereas Hang On was fast and easy to get into, GP Rider requires a far more nuanced level of play. These turns do not suffer mistakes of any kind. You need to crash quite a bit before you get any real feel for the control. I've seen people get really good at it though, so this might just be me. The deluxe sit-down cab looks a bit like the Manx TT Superbike units years later, and there was even a stand-up side-by-side cab available. Again, no accurate home version was ever ported, though there are Master System and Game Gear releases that carry the same name. Our final video game for the X board was 1991's AB Cop, short for Air Bike Cop. This was a mixture of Space Harrier and Chase HQ, where the goal is to run down bad guys on your hover bike and arrest them. You have a jump and a turbo boost at your disposal, though curiously no weapons. To take down the bad guys, you must crash them by bashing your bike into them. It's simple stuff, but the visuals are very nice, and the sense of speed is really satisfying. I've only ever seen a sit-down deluxe of this one, and only a Japanese version at that, though numerous sources claim a widespread release. It's yet another one that Sega never brought home, content the 32X and Sega CD could have desperately used. (1992) would be the final time Sega used the X board. Caribbean Bull was an 8-player dice game, essentially craps, made for arcade and entertainment centers in Japan. The unit used a video screen to control the game, and the X board handled the visuals there. Sega had these units in circulation and service all the way up until 2017, a startling 25-year run. As with many of these types of episodes, the striking story is that most of these games never came home 100% perfect. Outside of some ports to much weaker hardware, it amazes me that we still have no official way to play some of them. Line of Fire and AB Cop particularly. I'll never forget this era, however. Sega was on fire during this time, releasing not only awesome looking titles that played great, but also arcade machines that made the experience that much more appealing. Sega would complement the X board with the Y board in 1988. It gave us hits like Galaxy Force 2 and Rail Chase, cementing Sega's dominance in the pseudo 3D arena. I've always felt these games stood out at a time when everyone was copying the side-scrolling beat-em-ups and run-and-guns that seemed to dominate the arcade otherwise. Often when you played a Sega arcade game, there was nothing else like it. They were fast, thrilling, and gave you a sound and graphical presentation that wouldn't be equaled or surpassed until 3D polygons became a regular thing. If you'd like to play these today, the easiest way is MAME, where they look and run great. Set up the controller properly, and these can easily give you hours of enjoyment. I've said it before and I'll repeat it here. Sega is in desperate need of a sprite scaling compilation on modern consoles. These games still have a lot to offer. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.